There was no announcement, no warning, just a soft ping in my inbox on a Tuesday morning. Please help onboard Emily. She'll be shadowing you over the next few weeks. No subject line, no context, no explanation. I blinked, reread the line, then opened the attached calendar invite already scheduled under my name. Training session, internal process walkthrough, hosted by me, attended by her. I stared at the screen for a moment too long, then got up to refill my coffee, telling myself not to overthink it. After all, onboarding juniors wasn't new. I'd done it dozens of times in my 9 years at Hallworth and Linwood, a mid-sized consulting firm that ran on too much optimism and too little structure. I'd trained analysts, associates, even other managers. But this felt different. The timing, the silence, the absence of any real conversation. Still, I complied. I always had. I showed Emily our internal systems, the way I categorized client histories, how I structured proposals, even how I mapped stakeholder personalities for smoother negotiations. She was polite, eager, and oddly reserved for someone fresh out of business school. I chalked it up to nerves. She took notes relentlessly, always on paper, always in small cursive letters. She didn't ask many questions, but she observed everything. Too closely. I remember one afternoon when I showed her my customized workflow tracker, a tool I'd built over 3 years to streamline client delivery timelines. "Do others use this?" she asked. I shook my head. "No, I built it myself. It works better than the firm-wide system, but I never got around to formalizing it." She smiled, nodded, and wrote something down. I didn't think much of it at the time. I had always believed in transparency. In training from a place of generosity, I used to think knowledge hoarded was power wasted, so I gave freely. What I didn't realize was that I was handing her the blueprint. 3 weeks in, she had access to every workflow I designed, every project file I managed, and every client dashboard I updated daily. I thought I was preparing a teammate. I didn't know I was preparing a replacement. It happened in the form of a presentation. A quarterly strategy meeting I had helped assemble, build, and polish. As usual, I prepped the slides, compiled the data, outlined the key metrics. Emily was assigned to support logistics, upload files, manage formatting, and observe how cross-functional updates worked at scale. The meeting began, and I expected the usual: sit near the corner, walk through numbers, answer questions. But then, Victor, the head of operations, stood up and said, "We're excited to have Emily present today's update on the client delivery optimization model." My hands froze. I hadn't been told. My name wasn't on the agenda. And then she stood, calm, poised. Her first slide was mine, my language, my layout, even my custom color code. She didn't mention my name, not once, and no one asked. They all listened, nodded, complimented her composure. Victor smiled throughout like he'd discovered a prodigy. I sat still, quiet, no emotion, just awareness. Not of the betrayal. No, that would come later. What I realized in that moment was colder, more surgical. They didn't just want to use my tools. They wanted to remove the hands that built them. Quietly, permanently. And now they had a copy. After the meeting, no one looked at me. Not out of malice, out of convenience. The kind of studied avoidance you develop when you sense something isn't right, but decide not to get involved. I packed up my notes slowly, waiting, not for confrontation, but for confirmation. Surely someone would acknowledge what had just happened. A quick, "Thanks again for setting her up." Or maybe, "Great material, you really built something solid." But nothing came. Not even from Emily. She smiled at a few people, thanked Victor, then walked out with her notebook tucked under her arm like a prize. I returned to my desk, sat down, and opened the version history of the deck she had presented. I scrolled through edits, comments, timestamps. My name, my phrasing, my structure. The only difference? She had exported it as her own PDF. My hands hovered over the keyboard, not to act, but to pause. Because that moment wasn't a trigger. It was a signal, a silent alarm that something larger was unfolding, and I was the only one not pretending otherwise. The following day, her email signature changed. Emily Ward, Strategy Lead, Client Optimization. My title, my division. And still, no memo, no internal update, just a shift, like sand quietly moving underfoot. My calendar started to empty. Meetings I once led were now streamlined. Calls I usually hosted were rescheduled. One by one, projects I had initiated began forwarding to her, some with a double C, some without. I didn't object. I documented, because protest would have made it emotional. But records make it undeniable. By Friday, my access to one internal dashboard had been revoked. No explanation. I filed an IT ticket, received a generic realignment in system permissions reply, and that was that. I walked into the bathroom, locked the farthest stall, and sat down. Not to cry, but to breathe. Because this wasn't incompetence, it was intentional. And I needed to stay ahead of it. I opened my Notes app and began listing every instance of transference. Dates, names, files. Not because I planned to build a case, but because I knew someone would eventually need to see what really happened. And I wanted the record to exist outside memory. That weekend, I went back through our internal chat logs. I found the first messages where Emily asked for help understanding the client cadence model, then the ones where I sent her full exports, walked her through my filtering logic, explained which stakeholders to prioritize and why. I exported every chat, filed them into a locked folder labeled simply continuity. Because what they had done wasn't just about credit, it was about architecture. And I had been the builder. They could repaint the walls. But the foundation still held my name. Quietly, irrefutably. And one day, the client would notice. They always do. I didn't push back, not because I was afraid, but because I understood the tempo. You don't interrupt an orchestra in the middle of a performance. You wait until the silence afterward makes your note impossible to ignore. So I watched. Not Emily, not Victor. The system, the patterns, the people who looked the other way, the gaps that widened between what they said and what they did. I tracked the slow redistribution of responsibilities, the slide decks suddenly missing my input, the dashboards I could no longer access. And I took notes. Quietly, systematically. I had spent years building those systems, so I knew exactly where they left traces. Version histories, access logs, time-stamped edits. They were trying to replicate structure without understanding what held it together. And from the outside, it looked seamless. From the inside, it was splintering. That weekend, I printed every major email chain from the last 6 months, especially the ones involving clients. I compiled notes from calls where Emily was still shadowing, not leading. I highlighted the questions she had asked, the clarifications she had needed. It wasn't to discredit her, it was to map the timeline. Because someone eventually would ask, when did she take over? And I wanted the answer to be clear, not from opinion, but from record. I didn't keep this to myself out of secrecy. I kept it out of precision. There's a difference. One morning, 2 weeks into the transition, I received a message from one of our mid-tier clients. A polite inquiry. Hi, just checking. Will you still be our primary contact moving forward? I paused before replying, then typed, that's currently being evaluated internally, but if there's anything time-sensitive, feel free to loop me in directly. I hit send, then logged the message. Not because it was significant, but because every small fracture becomes a fault line. Meanwhile, Emily's confidence grew, but not in the way earned experience grows. It was inflated by validation she hadn't yet earned. I watched her present numbers she didn't understand, nod at metrics she hadn't built, smile through stakeholder calls with an over-polished ease that said, I know I'm being watched and I believe I belong here. But she didn't see the moments I saw. The client who hesitated before confirming a stat, the partner who double-checked a file, the consultant who reached out to me privately with a quiet, hey, is this how we're handling this now? I never contradicted. I never corrected. I simply replied, let me know if you need support. That line, more than any argument, held weight. It meant I'm still here, I'm still aware, and I haven't given up my seat. Just because someone's standing behind me doesn't mean I've left the room. They thought removing me was enough. But they hadn't accounted for this. I knew the work better than anyone. And the work always remembers its source. Always. By the end of the 3rd week, I no longer needed to look for cracks. They began appearing on their own. A client emailed the wrong file to Emily, expecting her to know the reference code I'd created 3 years ago. She didn't. Another asked about a custom metric built for their campaign reporting. She promised to get back to them, then forwarded the message to me, without context, without greeting. Just a subject line. Need help? I replied in one sentence. That metric was sunset last quarter, replaced with the new format outlined in last month's deck. She didn't respond, but the client CC'd me in the next email without being prompted. That was all I needed to see. I wasn't trying to prove a point, I was proving a pattern, a subtle, steady loop in which the work itself began rejecting the rewrite, like muscle memory pulling back toward its source. One by one, questions that had no answers started returning to my inbox. Not formally, not through management, just people bypassing protocol because they knew who held the real map. I didn't step in fully, I didn't claim anything. I just answered the questions, short and direct, then logged every exchange. The project I had trained her to lead was now floating. No anchor, no depth. It looked clean on the surface, but underneath, it was relying on borrowed structure. That's the thing about systems. You can steal the interface, the look, the tone, but unless you understand how they were built, they eventually stop responding. And Emily was beginning to realize it. She still walked the halls with confidence, still attended meetings, still took notes with that same little pen and leather notebook. But her eye contact started to shift. She looked at me less in passing, less in meetings. And when she did, it was never with certainty. Because now she knew what I knew. The foundation wasn't hers. It had never been. She was presenting outputs without ownership, numbers without origin. She had absorbed the frame but not the logic. And without logic, nothing holds. Victor, of course, remained untouched. He praised her publicly, shared her success in one internal memo. But I watched him in meetings, noticed how often he deferred to data, to structures he didn't understand. He had made a bet that the machine would keep running after the engineer was removed. And I was content to let him believe that. For now, because this wasn't my moment to rise. It was theirs to unravel. My strategy wasn't to confront. It was to maintain clarity, to let the silence grow, not as punishment, but as space. Space for them to realize what they'd removed, space for others to remember who had held it all together. I didn't need applause. I didn't even need acknowledgement. I just needed to stay still long enough for the truth to surface on its own. And it would. It always does. It started with a delay, just one. A small milestone update that was supposed to go out Monday morning didn't land until late Tuesday afternoon. Emily sent it without explanation, and when the client followed up asking if something had changed, she gave a vague response about shifting internal bandwidth. But that client had worked with me for nearly 5 years. They didn't need translation, they needed precision. The delay became a question. The question became a pattern. 2 more clients reached out within the same week, asking for clarifications on processes we had once executed with near-invisible efficiency. The system wasn't broken, it was drifting. Quietly, imperceptibly at first, but enough for those who depended on it to start noticing. One Thursday, I passed the break room and overheard Emily on the phone, her voice tight. "No, I'm sure that's how we normally handle it. I mean, I can double check, but I believe that's correct." She wasn't sure. She didn't believe. She was guessing. And worse, she was doing it live, under the watch of people who knew the difference. I walked on without stopping, not because I felt superior, but because I recognized the tension of someone trying to hold together a shape they didn't fully understand. The next sign came from procurement. A system-wide audit was requested. Nothing alarming, just routine, according to the internal memo. But I had been here long enough to know audits don't happen unless someone in leadership is trying to verify what's no longer clear from surface reporting. Behind that memo was doubt, and behind that doubt was a slow erosion of trust. Then came the moment that shifted everything. A client, one I had not spoken to directly in over a month, called my personal extension. Not the shared inbox. Not the team hotline. Me. "I'm just going to ask you," they said. "Are you still involved in this project?" I paused. "Not officially," I replied. "But I'm still here if you need anything clarified." A long silence. Then, "That's what I thought." No anger, just disappointment, wrapped in resignation. That's what Victor and Emily never understood. Clients don't invest in slides or structures. They invest in continuity, in knowing who will be there when the problem hits, when the deadline shrinks, when the answer needs to be delivered before the system catches up. And I had been that person. Quietly, repeatedly, reliably. Now, they weren't just missing the delivery, they were missing the assurance. and that absence was starting to echo louder than any performance review. By the time the end-of-month report came in, a full 2 projects had flagged escalation concerns. Both had been transitioned to Emily. Both now had timelines in red and budget efficiency scores trending downward. Victor still smiled in team meetings, still congratulated her for navigating a demanding portfolio, but I could see it in the tightness of his jaw, in the new habit he'd developed, checking his phone mid-meeting, glancing toward the hallway more than he used to. He felt it too. The unraveling wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. It wasn't a crash. It was a misalignment repeated until it became systemic. And I, quiet, constant, overlooked, I was now the only one in the room who still remembered how everything used to work, not out of pride, but out of practice. By the second week of the next quarter, no one could ignore it anymore. Deliverables were slipping. Internal feedback loops had grown sluggish. The once steady hum of coordination between departments had dulled into a kind of passive confusion. Too slow to panic, too disjointed to function. What once felt like oversight now looked like erosion. Emily, still holding the title, had begun to defer more often. Not openly, but in subtler ways. She sent more double-check emails, looped me in without comment, and forwarded client questions with fewer answers attached. Her sentences now started with phrases like, "as previously discussed," even when she wasn't part of the original conversation. I responded when necessary, no extra commentary, no edge, just enough clarity to stabilize the moment, then let it go. Because this was no longer about saving face. This was about letting the imbalance become visible. And it was. One morning, during a weekly operations review, Victor asked a question that landed with the weight of realization. Who's currently tracking the baseline metrics for client satisfaction across Q1 deliverables? Silence. Emily looked at her notes. I looked at the room. Then, without speaking, I opened my folder, slid a document across the table toward the team lead, and sat back. No fanfare, just facts. The document showed the decline. Slowly, over weeks. It showed when I stopped being the lead on the accounts, and it showed the moment the drop began. I didn't say it was my work. I didn't need to. The headers, formatting, and depth of the report said enough. The rest of the meeting passed in muted discomfort. No one questioned the data. No one thanked me. But when Victor wrapped up the session, he didn't make eye contact with anyone, especially not me. Later that afternoon, Diane from HR pinged me quietly. "There's some noise at the top," she wrote. "Executive review coming." I typed back a short response. Understood. No follow-up, no surprise. Because systems don't fall apart all at once. They unravel thread by thread until the illusion of structure becomes too fragile to hold itself up. And by now, everyone could feel it. The loss wasn't just about delayed metrics or mismanaged deliverables. It was about something deeper. Credibility. Trust, the kind that doesn't get rebuilt with a new title or a new hire. Victor had gambled on efficiency over experience, on polish over process. And now, even the junior analysts were starting to ask quiet questions, pulling me aside in the hallway, sending small thank you notes for guidance I had given months ago. Emily, meanwhile, had grown noticeably quieter, her walk less buoyant, her meetings more rehearsed. I saw it in her posture, in the pause before she clicked to the next slide. She knew it wasn't working, and though she still tried to play the part, there's only so long someone can pretend they built something they never understood. One evening, as I packed my bag to leave, a message landed in my inbox. From a former client. Short, Director. "Just checking in. Are you still available for side consulting? We miss your clarity." I didn't reply that night. I sat in the quiet, letting the screen glow in the dim of my office. Because the unraveling wasn't just theirs anymore. It was becoming an invitation, and I was ready to decide where the thread would lead next. It was a Thursday morning when the silence broke, not with confrontation, but with confusion. A message came from procurement, not to me, to the entire leadership team. Urgent clarification needed on Q2 billing discrepancies, client core unity requesting direct documentation of strategic deliverables. I read it twice. The name on the thread wasn't Emily's, it was mine. The client had used my name, my role, my record. They had reached for the version of the relationship that made sense to them, the one that worked, A few minutes later, another thread followed, this time from legal. Please confirm personnel involved in client decision-making and sign-off timelines. External audit in progress. Audit. That word isn't loud, but it carries weight, especially when it comes from the outside. I sat back in my chair, not surprised, just still. I had spent the past months preparing for this moment. Not with aggression, not with gossip, not with leverage, just with proof. Clean, dated, quiet proof. Around noon, Diane messaged me again. You didn't hear it from me, but Emily's name came up, and not in a good way. I closed my laptop, walked outside. Let the cold air hit my face like a reminder. I hadn't forced this. I had just waited. The next day, everything accelerated. Ellen Myers from Core Unity sent a formal letter. Not to the team, not to the shared inbox, but directly to executive leadership. The tone was calm, but final. We would like to revisit the original strategy proposal led by Samantha Rhodes. Please provide documentation of all personnel involved in the Greenspring transition and timeline of ownership change. Effective immediately, we request Samantha as primary contact for all ongoing initiatives. No anger, no dramatics, just redirection. Strategic. I received the forwarded message at 10:42 a.m., copied discreetly with no instruction. But I understood. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an instruction. The next 48 hours were a blur I didn't participate in. Emergency meetings, internal reviews. Victor called an all-hands for Monday. Emily was absent, her out-of-office reply didn't specify a return date, and when the meeting started, the room was packed. But no one spoke above a whisper. Victor opened with the usual polish. There have been misunderstandings. We're working toward clarity. Transparency is our priority. But nothing could soften the reality now. A key client had effectively demanded leadership change, and they had done it publicly, with documentation and a name. Mine. I didn't gloat. I didn't speak. I took notes as if it wasn't about me at all, because that was the point. It was never about recognition. It was about responsibility. And now the weight of what had been removed was making its way back, not by force, but by necessity. That afternoon, as I walked down the corridor, someone from finance caught up with me. Hey, for what it's worth, they said softly. Some of us always knew it was you holding it together. I nodded. Thank you. And kept walking. Because when the collapse comes, you don't need to explain your presence. You just need to be steady enough to stand in it without blinking. The formal apology came not in words, but in motion. A reshuffling of calendar invites. A quiet readdition of my name to project briefs. A sudden request for my input on things I was no longer supposed to touch. No one said, we were wrong. They simply started asking me things again, as if nothing had happened. As if the last 3 months had been a minor miscommunication, not a calculated removal. I responded the same way I always had. Clearly, concisely, professionally, because this wasn't my moment to gloat. It was my moment to decide what mattered. One afternoon, Victor called me into his office. For the first time in months, he looked tired. The confidence in his voice had thinned. Samantha, he began, we'd like to reinstate your leadership on the Greenspring initiative. The client trusts you and, well, we want to be aligned. I met his gaze. Aligned with what? He hesitated. With the client's expectations. With what works, I nodded slowly. So this isn't about merit, it's about recovery. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Look, I know things got off track, but the point is, we need you back where you belong. I stood still for a moment, then reached into my bag and pulled out the original strategic proposal, the one I had written, the one that had never been presented under my name. I placed it on his desk. This is what should have guided the project from the beginning, I said. Not new titles, not shortcuts, just work that was already complete and ignored. He opened the folder without replying. I didn't wait for a reaction. I'll continue supporting the project, I added, but not under the same structure. I'll report to the client directly. My contract will reflect that, and I won't be stepping back into a seat that was only offered once it became inconvenient to leave it empty. Victor blinked. You're rejecting the reinstatement? I'm accepting reality, I said, but on terms that don't rewrite what's already happened. A long silence followed. Then, to his credit, he nodded. Understood. I walked out with nothing in my hands. No badge, no plaque, no title card, just clarity, the kind that doesn't need applause to feel complete. Emily officially resigned the following week. No announcement, just a line in the internal HR tracker. Role concluded, position vacated. People asked questions, but not loudly. The culture had already shifted, from Polish to pause, from showmanship to scrutiny, from appearances to evidence. And in that shift, I didn't reclaim a title. I reclaimed something more lasting. The truth. That week, Ellen from Core Unity sent me a handwritten note. Thank you for staying still long enough to let the wrong version fall apart. I kept the card in my drawer, beside the pen I hadn't used in months. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. When you build something real, you don't need to hold it up forever. Sometimes you just need to outlast the performance. And the collapse? That's never the goal. It's just the inevitable outcome when someone believes they can replace understanding with imitation and expects no one to notice. I didn't return to the same desk. I didn't rejoin the same Slack channels or sit in the same meetings under a restored title. That door had closed. Not in anger, but with finality. I had outgrown it long before they noticed the void. When the dust settled, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clear. What they'd tried to remove wasn't just my role, it was my authorship. But even in silence, the shape of my work had remained. And now I had the chance to redraw it entirely. Ellen reached out again, this time not through a formal request, but with the ease of familiarity. We've been thinking, she wrote. What if we formalize the partnership? You, independent, us, direct. No filters, no middle management, real integration. It was the offer I hadn't dared name out loud. A chance to leave the politics behind, but keep the purpose intact. I didn't rush to reply. I took 2 days, long walks, quiet mornings, rereading my own notes like someone reviewing not just a job, but a chapter. When I finally responded, it was only one line. Yes, let's build something better. There was no onboarding process, no HR orientation, just a contract with one name on top, mine, and a role that wasn't handed down, but carved out of trust already earned. I entered the new office not as someone returning, but as someone invited. The team greeted me not with ceremony, but with steadiness. They knew who I was. They knew what I had done. I didn't have to prove anything. And in that absence of performance, I found room to work again. Real work. I led strategy sessions with engineers who cared about process, not politics. I reviewed proposals where no one asked if I'd loop someone in for optics. My ideas were debated, refined, implemented, not diluted to fit someone else's ego. And most of all, I slept. Deep, uninterrupted sleep. The kind you don't get when you're constantly trying to prove that you still belong in a place that's already decided to move on without you. The calls from Norview dwindled, at first polite check-ins, then inquiries masked as collaboration. I responded only when necessary, brief, professional, closed. I wasn't angry, I was done. That distinction mattered more than anyone realized, because the real legacy wasn't that I'd left. It was that I no longer needed them to validate what I already knew. I had become irreplaceable, not by shouting, not by demanding, but by refusing to disappear. And in that refusal, something had shifted permanently, not in them, in me. 2 weeks into the new role, I received a message from a junior analyst I'd worked with years ago. He was young then, quiet, unsure, always watching. His email was short. I saw the article, I knew it was you. Just wanted to say, thank you for showing what dignity looks like. I read it 3 times before closing the tab. It wasn't flattery, it was clarity. What I had done, what I had chosen not to do, had left a mark deeper than confrontation ever could. I hadn't fought to be seen. I had chosen to remain visible by doing the work no one else could replicate. And eventually, even the silence had to point back toward me. The article he referred to had appeared in a well-known industry newsletter, a feature on invisible architects of successful corporate systems. One segment detailed the quiet removal of a lead strategist during a multi-million-dollar rollout and how the client eventually refused to continue unless she returned. It didn't name me. It didn't need to. The story resonated far beyond my own. It mirrored the experience of hundreds, thousands of women who had carried systems in silence, only to be erased the moment spotlight arrived. And yet, the response wasn't outrage. It was recognition. Quiet messages, subtle affirmations. This felt familiar. Thank you for naming it. I thought I was the only one. That was the legacy, not the contract, not the correction, not even the collapse of the system that tried to replace me. It was in the echo, the long, steady ripple of one choice: to stay still long enough for the wrong version of the story to fall apart. And when it did, not to return in anger, but to walk forward with something no one else could claim: authorship, ownership, integrity. Victor eventually stepped down. No scandal, no headlines. Just a strategic realignment announcement buried in an internal memo. Emily took a role elsewhere, one line on her profile, no mention of Greenspring. Norview? They kept going. But something was different now. They hired slower, their language shifted. Their clients asked more questions. Not because of me, but because of what my absence had revealed. Systems only hide the truth for so long. I didn't burn the place down. I didn't sabotage. I didn't scream. I just didn't leave empty-handed. I took my process, my clarity, my quiet discipline, and I used it to build something better. Not bigger, not louder, just better. And sometimes that's the most enduring kind of power. Not the one that forces its way back in, but the one that steps out and makes them realize what they lost.